Of course, following the 9th episode of C64 Games, we must have the 9th Spectrum episode, and we start with a somewhat questionable entry, Set Willy II. Now, of course, I have to deliberate the questionability a bit. See, from the first moments of playing Manic Miner, I was always a big fan of the game, and still am. But I was never that big a fan of Set Willy because I didn't get to play it back in the day. I never had the first game, and while the second game I did have as a copy, I never got to play it, due to the copy protection screen for which I didn't have the code sheets. I do have some odd sense of nostalgia about the loading screen, which I did get to see a few times. The odd thing about it was that the copy I had made by some friend only started loading from the first bytes part of the loading sequence, so the loading attempt had to be made with a load quotation marks code command. The first time I did get to play either Set Willy was on the C64, but then it felt rather underwhelming because firstly, it should have been experienced in its original form on the ZX Spectrum, and secondly, it was far too late for me to discover to be enjoyable. Later on, I found out that the second Set Willy was something of a recalibration and an extended edition of the first one, which was originally released for the Amstrad CPC as Set Willy, and later for the Spectrum and C64 as a sequel. But of course, the nostalgia completionist that I am, I had to eventually buy an original copy of Set Willy II so I could finally play it as intended. Copy protection sheets and all. And as it happens, it actually feels different enough on the Spectrum to be somewhat enjoyable. Next up, we have yet another part in the adventures of Wally Week. This series has already featured the first two games, Automania and Pyjamarama, but although the series continued on to eventually have 5 games, my experiences with them ended with Everyone's a Wally from 1985, simply because the later parts in the series never came available to me on any platform until emulation came along, and then the rest of the series didn't have that much appeal to me. But this game, Everyone's a Wally, introduced a gameplay element into adventure games that not even Lucasfilm games would get to exploit the idea until 2 years later on. You have a group of 5 people in the so-called Wally gang, all of whom you're able to control at will, provided that you occupy the same screen with another gang member to be able to make the switch. All 5 members of the group have their own missions to accomplish, accordingly to their occupations. Wally himself is, as you've become to know through his earlier adventures, a handyman. Wilma is his wife who works at the library. Tom is a mechanic, Dick is a plumber, and Harry is an electrician. Herbert, the infant son of Wally and Wilma, makes his first appearance in this game as a non-playable hazard character, but was given his own adventure later on in this series as Herbert's dummy run. Everyone's a Wally plays much like Automania and Pyjamarama, but the play areas is now an entire city, and the game engine is vastly enhanced, so you need to deal with more complex puzzles. I would go so far as to say Everyone's a Wally was the pinnacle of an entire genre, far before Codemaster's Dizzy series even took form. I'm sorry to say I never completed this game, but I certainly had more fun exploring this game than the other two. Game number 3 for today is something many people might not expect, simply because International Karate is often considered to be a quintessential Commodore 64 game, which it is, make no mistake. However, it was originally developed for the ZX Spectrum, and that's where I first played it, and consequently feel more nostalgia towards it, despite the amazing Rob Hubbard soundtrack on the C64 and the admittedly better gameplay thanks to the complete reworking by the late, great Archer McLean. Still, the Spectrum version is what I grew up with with no in-game music but merely some high-quality speech samples spoken by the judge, and some fighting grunts and smash noises. I remember the graphics being spectacular at the time, despite not having differently colored suits for each of the two players. And to my then relatively inexperienced self, it even surpassed the more commonly known The Way of the Exploding Fist, which was also rather good. In hindsight, International Karate must have come about originally as an answer to Beam Software's Exploding Fist not being quite as magnificent on the Spectrum. System 3, still being primarily a Spectrum game publisher, did their own version of Exploding Fist with backdrops all over the world, a somewhat different control system, and now with the added bonus rounds that weren't included in the Spectrum version of Exploding Fist. Sure, it's a very different product from the Archer McLean version on the C64, but the significance of the original Spectrum version of International Karate cannot be understated. Next up, the second game in the famous Spectrum-originated franchise starring a blue ghost-like creature. Horace Goes Skiing was a game I didn't really get to play more than a few times back in the olden days, but thanks to Horace and the Spiders, which I did have, I was always somewhat obsessed about the series. Winter sports was also a theme that I liked in computer games, so combining the weird blue creature with wintry activities was an immediate win in my book. When I first played Horace Goes Skiing, though, I was surprised that the game started out with a Frogger clone level before you got to the actual skiing part, and the Frogger bit was surprisingly tough to pass. The idea is to cross the road, rent a pair of skis, and then cross the road back to the skiing slopes. Because Horace runs constantly with no brakes, you have to be really careful with the timing. You have no lives, but you do have $40 to spend at the beginning of the game, and each time you rent skis or pay an ambulance fee, $10 are taken away. For each 1,000 points you score, you receive another $10 to spend. So if you're really good, you could practically play the game for a small eternity. But Horace Goes Skiing, much like the other two Horace games, was never meant to be a game to be played for the long haul. It's a nice little coffee break fun sort of a game with enough content in it to give it some longevity, but the real power the entire Horace series has is the inimitable sense of nostalgia they have. Another undeniable C64 and Atari classic that I first played on the Spectrum and grew to enjoy more is Beachhead. This was originally written in the United States and published by Axis Software, but the Spectrum conversion by David Anderson really made something a bit more special about the game somehow. Also, F. David Thorpe's fantastic loading screen was imprinted into my mind long before I even started fantasizing about having a C64, a feature which made the C64 version feel considerably less impressive. If you've ever played any other action strategy game by Axis Software, you know the basic structure of Beachhead. The idea is, of course, to save the world from an enemy by participating in a few different kinds of war action sequences. Each action sequence is separated by a map screen in which you move a diamond-shaped cursor to designated spots, where the next action sequence takes place. In the first scene, you have to maneuver a set of submarines one by one through a canal with static mines and moving missiles. The second scene is a first-person sequence viewed from a ship where you shoot at fighter planes and bomb the ships. The final sequence is an automatically scrolling avoid-em-up that scrolls to the right, in which you control a bunch of tanks, again one by one, through a difficult terrain with obstacles until you reach an enemy cannon that you need to take down. Once you do that, you have completed the game. The one thing I'm not too crazy about in the Spectrum version of Beachhead is the sounds, but I like the graphics a lot more here than in the C64 version. But it's all good, and as far as I know, Beachhead is an excellent game on any platform you can find it on. I should probably do a comparison of it someday. T.L.L was a game publisher responsible for a small number of high-quality Spectrum classics, two of which have been featured in previous episodes, Saboteur and Jungle Trouble. If I had went strictly chronologically in my nostalgia trips, Scuba Dive is a game that would have appeared long ago, but better late than never. In Scuba Dive, you control a diver who's obviously wearing some scuba gear, and your mission is to pick up pearls from inside oysters and clams. Naturally, you need to avoid contact with any sea creatures, for any small contact with as minor an inconvenience as an eel or a fish will pop you up like a balloon. For a greater sense of adventure, you can attempt to get past an octopus and go deeper once you actually manage to find the passage. I admit I've never been particularly good at playing Scuba Dive, but the game inspires a sense of obligation to try it out every now and then, just because it was something that was played in our house when I was young, and I remember that my brother in particular used to like it. The Spectrum version is definitely much more inspirational than the C64 conversion, which can be said of practically any game by T.L.L, but until making this episode I had never really noticed that Scuba Dive was originally written for the Auric. Perhaps this also deserves a comparison. Now here's a game that escaped my notice for longer than necessary considering it's a certified Spectrum classic. Deathchase by Micromega from 1982, also often referred to as 3D Deathchase. And if you're the odd American to own a Timex TX2068, you might know the game as Cycle Path. In this game, you ride a motorcycle of some kind in an endless forest, chasing after the other motorists, who I suppose are the bad guys, and shoot rockets at them. Of course, being 3D, this all happens in a first-person perspective. The game takes turns in a day and night cycle, and after each day the forest gets denser and the areas begin to feature more patrol vehicles such as helicopters and tanks. The longer you stay alive and manage to destroy your enemies, the more money you make. There's really nothing more to this game, but for a 1982 Spectrum game, it is well ahead of its time. Although Deathchase was originally a Spectrum exclusive, it was popular enough to warrant many unofficial conversions and clones to Amstrad, Dragon, Commodore 16 and 64, Atari 8-bit, and most lately the MSX computers. But the original is where it's at and should be experienced as it was then. And now we have a couple of games that I have written comparisons of. First, here's another one of my brother's favorites called T.L.L, short for Tornado Low Level, by Vortex 1984. Because I didn't really play this game myself back in the day, before emulation made the game accessible again, my only memory of T.L.L was its stylish loading screen and a vague memory of an overhead view of flying an airplane of some sort. T.L.L is basically a target bombing game in a pseudo three-dimensional environment. You fly a jet bomber around scouting for targets in a large area of islands of various sizes, and you need to fly close to the ground so that the automatic bomb-dropping mechanism activates. Because of the way the game is mapped, and therefore your jet moves, it is often very difficult to align yourself with the targets, but that's part of the experience. It's a very nice game to look at, although the Amstrad version is arguably even more so. The Spectrum version is, however, the best optimized in playability, and that's the way it should be experienced. Another Spectrum favorite that also managed to find its way into my Commodore 64 collection later on is a World War II themed Gauntlet clone called Into the Eagle's Nest. by Pandora, released in 1987. Eagle's Nest is a much more interesting game than Gauntlet though, even if it doesn't have any sort of a multiplayer mode. You play as a lone soldier infiltrating a castle occupied by Nazis, and your ultimate goal is to rescue an American soldier from somewhere within the castle and then blow up the entire castle with explosives. There are certain gameplay elements which make Eagle's Nest clumsier than Gauntlet, but also elements that make it more adventurous, such as the aforementioned explosives. You can only carry a certain amount of ammunition, and you can only withstand a few hits from enemy fire before it's game over, so you do need to be careful as well as economical about everything. Bullets, food, even movement at certain points because of the way your enemies spawn. Although there are only 5 floors to get through, the challenge is immense, yet more rewarding than you might expect. Into the Eagle's Nest is still one of my all-time favorite Spectrum games, and even though there are technically better versions out there, I still tend to come back to this one. Considering my early gaming years with the ZX Spectrum were comparatively limited, I find that those few years were surprisingly educative. However, it looks like we're gonna be running out of games that I played on the ZX Spectrum in the 80s, so I decided to end this episode with a more recent finding through emulation that I liked well enough to buy into my collection. The game is called Not in 3D. It's a game that, as a concept, shouldn't really work. Basically, it's nothing more, nothing less than a first-person 3D version of Tron, or Snake, whichever you prefer, and you have no enemies other than yourself. Not in 3D is easily disorienting and even somewhat psychedelic as you make progress and get yourself eventually into a knot. Because of the game's 3-dimensional reformatting, there had to be a new scoring system. Just getting as much of distance traveled doesn't really do anything on its own. You need to literally tie yourself into as many and as dense knots as possible to get a higher score. The scores are displayed as linear meters, but there's also a line for fault, which indicates the amount of collisions you have made into your former self. Not in 3D is one of those games that have the ability to hypnotize you, drag you into the zone. It doesn't make a spectacle of itself though, as the graphics are just about functional. And there's barely any sounds at all. Perhaps exactly because of it, it is as brilliant as it is. And it should be experienced by every Spectrum enthusiast, and preferably others as well.